It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Denise Ellsworth is the program director for the pollinator program at OSU. She's been an extension for as long as I can remember, so that means we're both kind of getting old together, Denise. And she does a fantastic job. Many of you know her from her webinars on bees and beekeeping. So with that, we are going to have Denise then take over. Please give welcome, a good big round of applause if we could, to Denise Ellsworth.
Great, thanks Pam, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. Give me just a second to get that going. Okay. All right. Pam, you'll let me know if we're not looking good, but I'm gonna jump right in. Hi everybody, thanks for coming to learn about bees in your Ohio backyard. As Pam said, I'm with the OSU Department of Entomology out of Worcester, but I teach statewide. So many of you have probably met me or had me come in and talk about bees or bee habitat, pollinator habitat in your county. And so today we're going to talk about who's in your backyard, who we might see through the season, how to identify some of those bees. I want to do a shout out, first of all, to Olivia Carroll and Joe Wilson, who wrote this wonderful book, The Bees in Your Backyard, that I adapted the title from for Ohio, Bees in Your Ohio Backyard. This is an amazing book if you are looking for just one book that gives you some good natural history about bees, wonderful pictures, and just are really accessible. There's a lot of detail in the book, but it's not something that you can't you know, use and learn from. So a shout out to Olivia and Joe. And many of you have probably met Olivia. She's come to Ohio. We bring her every summer to do some workshops out in the field. And hopefully, depending on how things go with our timing, we're hoping to do another of those sessions this year. So you've probably heard about the insect apocalypse, some of our concerns about insects and their population, their conservation across the globe. And bees are, you know, a part of this concern. This slide comes to us from the University of Vermont that modeled some bee declines across the country, showing you know, up to 23% decrease in bee abundance. So how many bees are actually out there? And if we look up, you know, to our wonderful Great Lakes, we can see Ohio is pretty yellow in this picture. So a great threat of loss of bee abundance. And there are a number of reasons for that we really don't have time to get into today. But you've probably heard of this bee. This is the rusty patch bumblebee, which, as many of you know, this is our first bee to be added to the endangered species list. Used to be a fairly common bee in Ohio, but really hasn't been seen for more than a decade. We'll talk at the very end about how you can help through your photographs, your observations out there in your garden or other places that you are, help us kind of inventory what bees are out there in Ohio, which ones are doing well before they get to this state of you know, being of such concern that they make the endangered species list. So why do we care about pollinators? Well, there's so many reasons, right? We know that as gardeners that we need pollinators for our food. Many of our agricultural crops depend on pollinators. Those of us who love native plants know that most of those plants, about 75% of all plants on Earth, need an insect, a pollinator, to transfer that pollen from flower to flower. So all of those seeds and fruits out in nature that birds depend on, many mammals depend on, it really all comes back to the health of our pollinators. So who are those pollinators? Well, most of them are insects. We do have hummingbirds as our bird example in Ohio, but really the core of our pollinators are the insects. And whether that's moths or butterflies, flies, beetles, we have lots of insects that are cooperating to transfer that pollen from flower to flower. Here's a shot of a rose that I have in my garden, and you can see all these little flower flies or hover flies. And what I often find as I work with folks getting up close and personal with bees and flowers is that often these little guys are confused with bees. They look kind of bee-like, right? They're mimics taking advantage of that yellow and black coloration to get some protection, looking a little bit like a bee, but of course they can't sting. Sometimes these hoverflies will give you a little nip though, so it's really easy to confuse them with sweat bees, for example. We can see the great big eyes here, little short stubby antennae, and hard to tell in a picture, but only 2 wings tell us that these are actually flies. We think of monarchs as, you know, one of those pollinators that we want to conserve that's so important to us, this iconic insect. They actually don't do a lot of pollination themselves, that is visiting flowers and transferring pollen from flower to flower, but they're really there at flowers drinking nectar, right? That's their flight fuel. How about bats in Ohio as pollinators? Actually, we don't have any bats in the state that are pollinating. They're not flower visitors. Our bats are eating insects, and so they're not visiting flowers for food. But certainly in other parts of the country and other parts of the world, bats are important pollinators. So that really brings us to the bees, which are the most important pollinators, and we'll talk about a few reasons why. Bees are such wonderful pollinators, and they're really all over. We don't often notice all the different diversity of bees that's out there. This is a little buckhorn weed flower, right? This is the flower stalk of that weed that's out in your lawn. This is a tiny little thing, but look at, there's a little sweat bee at the top of this flower. And actually buckhorn will have some bees, some other pollinators visiting this flower. So these bees are really all over the place. We say we have about 400 species of bee in Ohio. We don't actually know how many, and that's part of this effort in the next 2 years that we'll ask master gardeners and OCVNers to get involved with, helping us to inventory the state to figure out where and who is out there as far as bees go. So often we think of this girl when we think of bees. This is a honeybee. But she's just one of those many species of bee that we have out there in Ohio. Bees are vegetarians, so they're visiting flowers for pollen and nectar. That's their food. The pollen is the protein source, and nectar is the flight fuel. Their cousins are the stinging wasps. So bees and wasps, the stinging wasp are very closely related. But wasps are carnivores. So these stinging wasps are capturing, in this case, cicadas. This is the cicada killer wasp, capturing this dog-day cicada, paralyzing that cicada, and then dragging it to her underground burrow. So whether it's a mud dauber wasp that's gathering spiders, as this example, and taking those spiders back to those mud tubes, wasps are using insects or spiders for their protein source, while bees are using pollen. So bees are adapted for that diet, right? They have generally very fuzzy bodies covered with lots of hairs. They also have branched hairs that are, we call them plumose or feathery, so that they're adapted to grab that pollen and hold on to it. Bees also have a static charge to their bodies, which is pretty amazing. Scientists were able to really illuminate this a couple years ago, showing that bees have a positive charge and flowers have a negative charge. So this difference in charge is one way that bees can sense a flower and whether a bee has just visited a flower. So how rewarding will that flower be to visit? And she can sense that through her body. On her body, bees have different places that they're gathering and transporting pollen depending on the species of the bee. So in the top left corner, this leaf-cutting bee, she has long hairs on her abdomen. On the bottom left, this mining bee, she has hairy armpits and also hairs on her hind legs where she gathers dusty pollen. And then on the right, this bumblebee with those pockets that are packed full of pollen, added in with nectar to make this kind of, this bee bread or bee butter that's packed into those hind legs. So when I talk about all these bees on the screen, I say she. So only the female bees are gathering and transporting pollen. They're the only ones that are adapted to do that work. So if we saw a male bumblebee, he wouldn't have pockets. It's not a job that he does. Or if we saw a male leaf-cutting bee or a male Andrena mining bee, they wouldn't have those pollen-collecting hairs. So only the females are adapted for that work. Here's an up-close look at those hairs on a bee with those branches at the end. I mean, these are pollen grains that are held on to those hairs. On a wasp would just have a single strand, wouldn't have those plumose hairs. So bees are also faithful to flowers. They have this behavior where they tend to come back to the same species of flower over and over, either over multiple trips or over the course of a day or over multiple days. They tend to be faithful to the flower that's giving them the reward, the pollen or the nectar. And so for the flower, that's a real bonus because their pollen isn't being wasted. You know, as the butterfly, for example, which doesn't have a lot of a constancy, flower constancy or faithfulness, moves from this iris maybe to a dandelion to a honeysuckle, and then that pollen of the original flower is kind of wasted. And so that faithfulness is sort of a deal between the flower and the bee saying, I'll give you a little reward, but you need to take it, leave, and then come back with pollen from a compatible flower. Bees are also something we call central place foragers. Boy, I think all of us are kind of trapped in our central places right now. So the central place is where this bee lives. And then she forages out from there, a certain radius from that nest or from that hive, coming back home then to provision cells for the young or to care for the young. So in this example here, we have a little tunnel nest. This is a little mason bee that's just coming out. And that tunnel then is the central place. And if this is a female bee, she's leaving that tunnel. She's foraging out from there, a radius for mason bees only about 800 feet from that tunnel. A larger bee like a honeybee or a bumblebee leaving that hive, they may go a radius of 3 miles or so, depending on whether, where's the food and how far do they have to go to find it. But always then coming back to that central place. Okay, and that's another thing that makes bees such reliable pollinators, and why honeybees can be used to pollinate different crops. So a beekeeper can take that colony, can move it into a new field, and know that those bees are going to forage out from the colony and always come back home, bringing that pollen back to the hive. And so they're doing that pollination service right around where the colony is. So that idea of central place foraging is really important for bees. So for example, if you have a lot of flowers in your garden that are great for bees and you're like, I should have a lot of wild or native bees, but I don't see very many bees in my yard. It could be that you don't have places for those bees to nest, because if they can't live close by, they can't fly maybe far enough to find your flowers. So that little tiny sweat bee that we saw on that buckhorn, that bee may only be able to fly 200 feet, say, from where it lives. And if you don't have a place for them to nest, you're not going to have those bees visiting your garden. Here's this really cool study that some researchers in Britain did a few years ago that kind of illustrates this idea of central place foragers. So they took these bumblebee colonies, and the blue dot in the middle of each of these images is where they put the colony. So they put the colony out in the field, and then they opened the door and said, go ahead, bees, and visit those flowers. But first, look at the bottom right-hand corner. They took individual workers and they glued a little radar transponder onto each of their backs. And you can do that with bumblebees because they're big and robust. You know, they're strong flyers, so they can take a little extra weight on there. So then the researchers could track every trip that that bee took from that central place, from that nest, and then foraging through the field, always coming back home. So if we look at the top left under image A, we can see that what the colors tell you is the early flights are in green and early in her life. And they recorded every bout or trip from that central place until the bees didn't come back. So the early trips are in green, and we can see that that bee, BA, I wish she had a better name, BA is kind of exploring, where am I, what's going on here? So her green trips are kind of exploratory. Then her yellow trips in kind of the middle of this study, the middle of her bouts, she knows exactly where to go. She knows the flower source over there on the side of the field. She visits the flower source and makes a beeline, right? That's where it comes from, straight back to the central place. When the farmer mowed the field, mowed those flowers down, then she had to transfer onto another flower, and that's where the red lines come in. So she's transferring, or she's traveling back and forth to that other source of food. Okay, so this idea of central place foraging is really key for bees. So let's look at this, this field. You know, this is pretty common for all of us in Ohio, modern agriculture with these really big fields and little remnant bits of forest. And so these remnant forests can be really important for bee conservation because the bees can be living there in that little forested area and then foraging out from where they're living. But imagine if you're a little bee and you live in those trees, a small bee, you can't fly very far. And so if this was a field of, for example, canola that needed bee pollinators, those bees couldn't get from the edge all the way to the center of that field and back. So that's one of the issues with pollination services in modern fields. So let's talk about seasonality and bees. So different bees are active at different times of year. The queen bees for bumblebees, some of you may be from Cincinnati, and you're already maybe seeing some queen bumblebees, and we'll talk about a bumblebee's life history in just a minute. But the queen bees are out early. They actually hibernate underground and then emerge from a little den, a little hibernacula. So we see them early in the season. We also see mason bees early on, as in the top right there, or polyester bees in the bottom right. And so some bees are out early in the season, some in middle of the summer, other bees, different species, later in the year. So we can actually use that seasonality or that phenology to help us identify which bees we might be seeing. We can also talk about bees in terms of their life cycle. So on the right, we see social bees. This is an example of a honeybee colony. So this big bee is the queen, and then these smaller bees are her workers, her daughters. They live together in a social network. They communicate with each other. The queen is laying eggs, and the workers are tending to those eggs, helping to bring on the next generation of sisters. So actually the social bees are kind of the exception in the bee world. We often think of a queen bee and you know, that colony as the norm, but that's actually not how most bees live. Most bees are solitary, and that means just moms and dads. The males are really just there to mate, and then the moms are provisioning tunnels in the ground, for example, and that on the left we see a polyester bee that lives in the ground, or a cavity nesting or tunnel nesting bee like this mason bee, where those females are just provisioning little individual cells, nursery cells, for the offspring. So most bees on Earth are actually solitary ground nesting bees. We're not going to spend a lot of time on honeybees. We could spend hours and days and weeks and months on honeybees. There's so much to know and so much to learn, but they are a social bee living in a colony, not native to North America. We'll use bumblebees as our example of a native bee and look at their life cycle. So this is a really common species of bumblebee. This is the common eastern bumble, and this is a queen who was out in Cyprus arboretum a couple years ago, early in the season. So as I said, the queens overwinter. They're actually the only bumblebees who survive the winter, are the newly mated queens. All the old workers, the old queen, and the drones all died at the end of last year. So only the queens will survive. They spend the winter underground, not in the old nest, but just in a little, you know, a place in the side of your compost pile, or a little area with friable soil at the edge of your garden bed or the edge of the woods. And she kind of digs down and finds or creates just a little hole there where she spends the winter. Then in spring, right about now, right, so I think of those early cherries blooming as the time when I expect to start to see queen bumblebees. She comes out, she has to find a new place to create a nest, and then she starts to gather pollen and nectar. She's going to lay a batch of eggs and rear those with the pollen and nectar, using her body to vibrate, to create heat, to warm those eggs and warm those larvae until they eventually pupate and emerge as all her daughters. Okay, so she doesn't need males. She actually already mated. We'll kind of connect the dots here with that whole cycle. And she doesn't mate with her sons. She later in the season lays eggs that will be males, and they'll mate with new queens from virgin queens from other colonies. So that first batch of workers, all daughters, and they're very small. Look at that picture in the bottom center of the screen, and you can see that queen is very large and those first workers very, very small. They didn't have a lot of food or resources, and so they're not very large. Adult insects never get bigger, and so they're always going to be small. The next batch of worker, the queen lays another dozen eggs or so, and the next batch probably has a little more food, right? Maybe we're into some crab apples blooming or red buds, and so there's more food and those bumbles will be larger. Then eventually the queen, she can decide whether her offspring will be male or female. She decides to lay some offspring that will be male. She lays some that they would be workers, but they feed them extra food and some chemicals, most likely from the queen's body, some pheromones that instead of workers, those larvae will become queens, virgin queens. So the virgin queens leave the nest, the drones leave the nest, they mate with others of the same species, and then those mated queens are the only bumbles that survive next winter. Okay, so bumblebees have an annual colony cycle. So each colony only lasts for a year. A queen in the spring has to create the entire colony, and then she dies at the end of the year, and the new queen next year has to create that whole colony again. So just a quick look at a clay pot that I forgot. I haven't done my fall cleanup yet, have you? I forgot to do my fall cleanup early one year. It was early April, and my clay pot was upside down in the garden, and my dog noticed a queen bumblebee flying in and out of the drain hole. So look at that mass of grass there. She had actually gathered that grass up and was going to make a little nest there in the garden. Here's another, a reason for all of us to grow more crocus. Look at those queen bumbles. I see 4 queen common impatiens, common eastern bombus impatiens bumblebees there, along with a honeybee who did a little photo bomb. Here's another indicator for me when I expect to see queens flying, or when those Virginia bluebells are in bloom. So think of that kind of timing. It's not going to be too long now, and we'll expect to see some queen activity. And what is she doing? Well, she's looking for a dark spot. She's looking for, looking under leaves, hunting for an abandoned mouse hole or a cavity in a rock wall where she can create a nest. They don't reuse last year's nest. They find a new space for the nest, and that's so they don't build up pathogens over time in that nest. Bumblebees are also known as buzz pollinators, so they can vibrate their bodies, and they can do this in the tone of a middle C. It's the hey and hey Jude. So she sings to the flower, and something like a tomato, a pepper, a cranberry will then explosively release its pollen for her. Honeybees are tone deaf. They can't sing hey Jude, and so they're not able to buzz pollinate. Here's the space on that hind leg where she's gathering that pollen up close. So she's weaving that pollen, mixing it with nectar, and weaving those hairs in to hold that big glob onto her leg. And they can nest on the ground or in the ground. So maybe at the base of some bunch grasses, you've had bumblebees nesting there in the garden. They don't need an insulated or really protected spot that is as far as protection in winter, because they don't spend the winter there. And then here's a new queen that emerged. That's my husband and me in front of a Starbucks a couple Octobers ago. And this brand new queen flew along. She noticed that we had a packet of sugar and a packet of honey on our little cafe table, and she came to take a drink. She has to fill her abdomen up with fat to get through the winter, much as we do with pumpkin pie. When she comes out, after she builds up with fat, she also needs to mate. Bumblebees are monogamous. They only mate once, although on the left there, we see two drones trying to get lucky, but only one will. Okay, so that's kind of our introduction to bumblebees. Really fascinating life history, a truly social bee. Have an annual colony, and we're going to see queens out right now if you haven't seen some already, maybe if you're down in Cincinnati. So let's turn our attention to some of the other bees that call Ohio home. This is actually the head of a large carpenter bee and a tiny little perdita bee that was perched on here for the picture, but you can see just some of the diversity that we have in our bees. So our solitary bees, just moms and dads. Most solitary bees have only one generation per year, although some do have repeating cycles. So the top middle, this is our Andrena mining bee. She has hairy armpits. She emerges from a tunnel in the ground. From that tunnel then, she kicks out all the sand and soil that settled in last year, then gathers pollen and nectar to make that bee bread, lays an egg that's down in the smaller picture in the middle and the bottom, and then that egg hatches out, that's the larva. And that bee bread is all the food that that larva needs to develop into an adult bee. The pupa is there, the next picture at about 10 o'clock, and then the bee up there in the middle of the screen as the adult. So this mom does all the work at the beginning. She never meets her offspring. And each adult female may only be able to provision nursery cells for maybe 10 or 12 offspring, so much smaller numbers of offspring than other examples of bees, such as honeybees or bumbles. So here's an example that I'd love to go here to the Toledo Botanical Garden and in the spring and see if the polyester bees or Caletes, tickle bees are out. You can see that this is under a large oak tree, and you can see that the leaves haven't emerged yet from the shade that's being cast. So this is very early in the spring. These solitary bees that are soil nesters are typically nesting in south-facing slopes, so they're well-drained, usually sandy soils, and they're warming up from that early morning sun. They can't generate their own heat. They don't live together in groups, and so they have to place themselves in a place where sun is going to help warm them up. So here's the middle of one of those little volcanoes that we saw. This is the female who comes out. This is all the sand that she kicked out of her tunnel from last year. I usually look for these when star magnolias are in bloom. So our star magnolias are in bloom, maybe yours are. And so if you start to see these little mounds of soil, you might have some, they're different species, of course, but some of those mining bees, polyester bees or Andrena mining bees. Then we'll move on to our tunnel nesters. This is an example of a tunnel nester, the mason bees. So again, a very early season bee here. If you're seeing bees, especially if you have maybe a brick enclosed porch where bees may have gotten into a little space between the bricks, these are often mason bees. And they're called mason bees because they use mud to divide the walls between each of their little nursery cells. So this is what they do when they emerge. There's the male on top, the female on the bottom. She's not called a queen, she's just a mom. She's not a queen at all. She doesn't communicate. She doesn't lay large numbers of offspring. She just mates with the male. Then he's pretty much done his work, and she then saves that sperm in her body and uses it to fertilize or not fertilize eggs, depending on whether she needs female or male offspring. So the male masons, look how he has kind of a shaggy white or creamy mustache in the middle of his face. That's one way that we can tell the male masons. And they usually emerge sooner than the females. They're out there ready, then waiting for the females to emerge. Another kind of tunnel nester, this is evidence of leaf cutting bees. So you've probably seen these little leaf discs missing from your epimedium, from your red buds, your katsuras, iteas. It looks like your neighbor came over and played a joke on you, right? With a hole punch, punching out little perfectly round leaf discs. And so this is what the leaf cutting bee is doing. She's not eating these discs, but she's using them, she's taking them back to her colony, chewing these leaf discs off with her mouth parts, and she rolls each one between her legs and flies back to her cavity, wherever that is. Here she is on your rose. And then she's gathering up that leaf disc and flying back to some sort of cavity. It can be the, you have maybe some bamboo wind chimes and she's flying into the hollow centers of that bamboo. Maybe you have some raspberries that you prune the canes off. Those are usually hollow or pithy centers, so she may nest in there. Maybe the drain holes in your metal patio furniture. So she just needs a cavity. It doesn't really matter what kind of cavity. She just needs a place to make these little nursery cells. So this is an example from my own garden. I had a water outlet out back that I didn't use one summer because we had a really wet summer. And so when I finally went to turn the water on, I was cutting some flowers for a friend. So I had a big mason jar with me and I wanted some water in there as I cut. And into the mason jar came these discs, right? So these are discs from our leaf cutting bees. Each one of those little stuffed grape leaves is where one larva would have lived. And the mom, you can see those look like rose leaves. Yes, those are my rose leaves. But she also brought petal pieces back. And I know that because I walked around to see what she had harvested from my garden. And some of my oak leaf hydrangeas had these little leaf discs removed. So what a good mom, one by one, she took up to about 30 or 40 leaf discs and she lined that little cavity. She made a crib mattress, then she lined the nursery walls, then she brought pollen and nectar back in there, laid an egg, and then finally used more leaf discs to seal off each of those individual nursery cells. Could take her a whole day to make one of those nursery cells. And then the next day, if it's warm and sunny, she'll do the whole thing again. Another cavity nesting bee that we're maybe not so fond of is the large carpenter bee. So looks similar to a bumblebee, but we notice the shine on the abdomen here. We say that carpenter bees have shiny hiney's and bumblebees have fuzzy butts. We do have some hairs here on this carpenter bee's abdomen, but just that really noticeable shine. Bumblebees are not going to have that. And so what do? Well, we know that carpenter bees chew in and nest in wood, and that can be on our patio furniture or Adirondack chair, sometimes the siding, the cedar sided in our homes. But what's even worse than the carpenter bees is who did this damage, which is woodpeckers. So inside that wood was a row of carpenter bees nesting. So egg, larva, pupa, and adults developing in that wood and then emerging as adults. The woodpeckers sense those bees in there and they peck out the wood to eat the bees. So once you've let a problem build up this much, you really have trouble because they're somewhat difficult to get rid of. Here, they don't need much wood. Here's an example of those carpenter bees nesting in this little bench. Here we see them flying, making that beeline, right, going back into that wood. The carpenter bees that you'll see soon on a warm day out or flying around your porch or wood structure, the ones that are kind of playing chicken with you, come flying up really close to your face or fighting with other bees are typically the males. The females are back tucked into that wood, but it's the males who are more protective and kind of bullying. So we can tell a male because he has this yellow patch between his great big eyes. Why could we grab the male and hold him? You can actually hold him between the thorax and kind of pet him. He'll buzz a little bit and it's a good party trick, and then you can let him go. He can't sting you, right? Because no male bees can sting. This is another kind of carpenter bee. It's another species, another genus. This is the Serotina, the small carpenter bees, so much, much smaller. This bee, it's interesting, they will nest in pithy stems. They don't do any wood destroying, they're not a problematic bee. But here's an example of, on the left screen, we have this is a piece of my fennel that I cut off and left the pithy stalks standing. So when you're doing your fall cleanup next week, when it warms up, leave some of those perennial stems, maybe knee height or hip height. The hollow ones or the pithy centers, then little individual solitary bees can move in there. They don't damage the plants, they just move into that dead center. In the middle, you'll see one of my raspberry canes. I cut the cane and slit it open last year and was able to see the mom, who's up there in the top right, the female carpenter bee. In the bottom right, you can see the pollen ball that, and then the egg that stuck onto that pollen ball that was in one of those chambers in the middle of that raspberry. I wanted to open that up and see what she was doing, and then I put the stem back together. I sealed it up with masking tape and I clipped it out back onto the raspberries, and the mom just went along. She was like, this is my spot. This is a different kind of sociality in this bee where they do tend a little bit to their daughters. So they're not strictly solitary, but they're also not strictly social. So you probably will see these small dark bees out in your garden. Another bee you're very likely to see is this wool carder bee. So in coloration, it looks more like a wasp, right? The yellow and black. They kind of fly more like a hoverfly, but if you have lamb's ear, you're gonna see this bee, especially the males, they'll kind of fly up and down, guarding that lamb's ear flower. The males actually have two spines on the back of their abdomen, and if you look in the top left, at the very back of that picture, you could just see two little spines, and he'll use those spines to try to bump into other bees to get them away from his flower. You thought it was yours, but it's actually his. So the female, she's called a wool carder because she'll gather up the wool. She'll card the wool from your lamb's ear or other fuzzy plants. She'll roll, you can see in the little inset there is the female. She's rolling up those leaf hairs. So instead of using leaf discs like our leaf cutting bee, the wool carder bee uses leaf hairs to make that crib mattress to line the nursery walls. Then she puts in the bee bread, the egg, and then more fluff. So if you ever see a bald spot on your lamb's ear, like you see here on mine, that's from the wool carders. You know that you have some wool carders harvesting that fuzz. And actually last year I saw a wool carder working on fluff, or gathering and collecting fluff from milkweed. So the seed pods had opened and she was there gathering those fluffy hairs from milkweed. So that was pretty cool. Okay, so we're going to talk about specialist bees. This is a different kind of idea if you're sort of new to the world of bees, but about a third of all bees are specialist. A generalist bee is something like the honeybee or the bumblebee. They go to a lot of different flowers, and they're generalist pollinators. They can visit lots of different flowers for food. A specialist bee, on the other hand, has a very narrow range of plants that she will collect pollen from, so they're pollen specialists, and that's to feed to the young or to provision cells for the young. So in this example, we have a squash bee, and the female only gathers pollen from squash, cucumbers, gourds, pumpkins in that close family. That's the only pollen that she gathers to provision underground cells. She actually is a solitary ground nesting bee, and she provisions those cells underground with that pollen. Now, if we dug up that larva and we brought it into the lab and we forced it to eat, let's say, corn pollen or goldenrod pollen or some other kind of pollen, that larva might develop, but when the adult emerged, they're hardwired. They will go right back to squash, gourd, and pumpkin. So they have a very specialized diet. And this is important as we think about what plants to include in our landscape. If we don't have some of these native plants that the specialist bees need, we're not going to provide what those bees, the food that they need. We're not going to have those bees visiting our gardens. So this is a different specialist bee that is visiting ironweed. So she can go to lots of different flowers for nectar, but she can only get pollen from ironweed. And we see here on the left, actually both pictures, you can see her chaps or her hind legs are just full of white fluff, and that's the white pollen from ironweed. So it only takes one ironweed plant. We don't have to have a whole pasture of ironweed to provide enough food for this bee to rear her young. So 7 flowers on one plant is plenty to have the offspring. So really underscores the importance of including those native plants in our gardens. Here's another specialist bee, and this bee needs asters to gather pollen to provision cells for the young. Here's another example, goldenrod. So goldenrod actually has 11 bees that specialize on goldenrod pollen. So we know when we see goldenrod in bloom, we see lots of different bees and butterflies and beetles visiting that plant. So the plant provides food for a lot more than 11 species of pollinator, but 11 of those bee species are specialists on goldenrod. They have to have goldenrod pollen. So again, kind of underscores the importance of including those native plants. And it's not just perennials. There are trees and shrubs that are plants that specialist bees need as well. Here's willow. Hopefully you have a pussy willow that's about to bloom. Well, there are 11 specialist bee species that have to visit willow to provision cells for their young. Okay, kind of the last group of bees that we're going to look at are the cuckoo bees. Cuckoos, we know that cuckoos in the bird world will lay their eggs in another bird's nest. So cuckoos in the bee world will do the same thing. They'll lay their eggs in another bee's nest or colony. And so if you look at all of these bees on the screen kind of in general, they don't look a lot like bees. They aren't very hairy. What often happens with cuckoo bees is that they have thickened exoskeletons, or their body skin is thickened. That's to protect them a little bit. Because what they're going to do, and here's an example, this is a cuckoo bee that will come to that leaf cutting bee's nesting tunnel and take it over, so to speak. So remember, in my water spigot, I had a leaf cutting bee, and she's making trip after trip, bringing leaf discs back, bringing the pollen and nectar back. Well, this little bee here, this cuckoo bee, has been watching. And when that mom leaf cutting bee leaves, the cuckoo comes into that tunnel. She lays her egg in that tunnel on the food, and then she leaves. The leaf cutting bee mom comes back, none the wiser, and seals up that little chamber. So what is in the middle of that chamber now is the leaf cutting bee egg, the cuckoo egg, enough food for one of them to live, and this fast emerging predaceous bee. So the leaf cutting bee, the cuckoo bee will hatch first. And that first larval stage, that first instar, they have sickle-like jaws, and so they'll slice the egg or slice the larva of that leaf-cutting bee in half and then eat the food. So they're called kleptoparasites. They steal the food from other bees. So a lot of people don't like the idea of cuckoo bees. They're like, that doesn't seem fair. They don't do the work. But actually, it's a good thing if you see some of these cuckoo bees in your own garden. It means that you have a lot of bee diversity, because it takes a lot of different bees to, most of these cuckoos will specialize on one genus or one small group of bees. So if you see some cuckoos, it's really, it's kind of a good thing. You're doing something right. You're inviting lots of different bees into your garden. Okay, just a few simple steps to wrap us up here, some things that we can all do to help bees and other pollinators. Of course, growing more flowers for pollinators, but it's not just any flowers, right? It's not so much our geraniums and our impatiens, but growing flowers that are really magnets for bees. So watching our plants, really seeing what they're visiting, which bees are visiting, which butterflies are coming, and planting more of those flowers. Protecting habitat for nesting and resting. We saw how some of that bare soil, a lot of times as gardeners, we don't want bare soil, but if we have places where small solitary bees are nesting, I didn't mention that they're not aggressive whatsoever because they're solitary, they don't defend their colony, they don't protect each other, and so very, very unlikely to sting. So protecting that habitat for nesting and resting, those tunnel spaces, that bare soil, or places where we may have bumblebees nesting. Reducing or eliminating pesticide use is important. Some pesticides can actually confuse bees. It can make them forget which foods they prefer to feed on, or they forget how to get back home. And so if you're a busy worker bumblebee trying to gather food so that your sisters can develop, but you forget to get home or forget how to come home, that's bad news for the colony. And then spread the word. Help other people know the importance of pollinators, the amazing diversity of bees. Here's a few of our master gardeners out in a meadow in Akron a couple years ago. And you see that we have nets and we have vials and cameras, and we're taking pictures of the bees that we're seeing there in the field. We're taking pictures because there's a project on iNaturalist, which is a free app. And so if you go to this Go address, go.osu.edu/OhioBeeAtlas, you'll find more about iNaturalist and this project. And anytime you take a picture of a bee in anywhere in the state, that picture, that observation automatically feeds into our statewide project. So we have over 130 different species of bees that have been identified through iNaturalist, about 12,000 observations, and a lot of people out there taking pictures and uploading their observation. And so you don't have to know what bees you're seeing. That's one of the great things about iNaturalist, is that when you make an observation, take a picture, it goes up into the cloud and people will help you to identify what you're seeing. So it's a really great learning tool. It's not just bees. You could use this for wildflowers, for butterflies, anything living or formerly living. So I actually was sweeping a little area outside of my garage door yesterday, gently sweeping where I have some Kenilworth ivy, and a little salamander popped out. I took a picture of the salamander, posted it to iNaturalist, and learned that I had I think it was a red-backed salamander, which was about 1.5 inches long. It was very, very cute, living right there in my driveway crack. So I put that little salamander back in. It was a nice wet day, and off she went. So I've listed I have uploaded a PDF of this handout onto this website here, this go.osu.edu/gardens and bees. And so if you go to that website, you can download a PDF of today's talk. And I've also uploaded the entire slide program into Google Slides, so you can go back and see that. You're welcome to download that. I'm happy to share my slides. So if you're doing programs or want to just look at the slides again, those are all available to you. And then on the right, you see a not very good great copy of our Common Bees of Ohio card. It's a laminated card with some of our most common species in the state. So some of you have these maybe in your back pocket or in the car, but if that's new to you or you'd like a copy mailed to you, I don't have a lot happening right now, and I have a lot of bee cards in my garage. So if you will send me a self-addressed stamped envelope, my kids are in their 20s. They have no idea what's a SASE. What is a self-addressed stamped envelopes? Anyway, send me a self-addressed stamped envelope. My address is right down there. And I will put a bee card in the mail to you, so you can have one of those. When the bees come out, you're gonna see bees any day. First, we're gonna see those queen bumbles. We're gonna see mason bees, Andrina mining bees, the Caletes, and then, you know, the next cast of characters, the small carpenter bees, the large carpenter bees. And now you know lots of those bees and how to identify them. Couple places to go for more information: the Xerces Society at www.xerces.org. Lots of good information, fact sheets, plant lists, really great resources there, creating habitat, organic means to prepare a meadow for seeding. So I really recommend Xerces. Also Pollinator Partnership, that again, they have a plant list, eco-regional guides to help you select plants for pollinators. And they're at www.pollinator.org. And then I'm at blab.osu.edu, and I have similar things, right? Plant list, PowerPoints that I'm happy to share, lots of good resources there. So here we are at the end of the bee, the end of the talk. You heard Zoe barking. You know, they say with these webinars that kids and dogs are now invited since we're all working from home. So fortunately, my neighbor wasn't out with the leaf blower today, but Zoe was out there barking to say hi.
All right, Denise, we do have several
And then
questions.
here's my contact information. Oh, sure. Go ahead, Pam.
Okay. All right. When I posted a picture of a bee on a hyacinth a few days ago, I got feedback that because she was very dark, she was probably feral. What does that mean?
Okay, say again. You posted a picture of a bee on a hyacinth.
Picture, she got feedback that the bee was, because she was very dark, she is probably feral. What does that mean?
So I'm guessing that the person identified that as a honeybee. So it wouldn't necessarily mean that it's feral, but honeybees have, so one queen actually in the honeybee world, remember I said bumblebees are monogamous. They have one male that they mate with, and they mate once for life. Honeybees mate, they have a mating period of a couple days, but they'll mate with multiple drones. And so a well-mated honeybee queen may mate with a dozen or 20 or more drones. And so as she is deciding whether she can add sperm to an egg, that makes it a female, a worker, or she doesn't add sperm, and that makes it a male, a drone. And so imagine she's adding sperm to each egg, but there is a variety of sperm donors, of mates, right, that can fertilize that egg. So all those workers in a colony can have different dads. Some of the dads are darker in coloration on the exoskeleton, some are more honey or orange colored, so there can be a lot of variety in there, even though they're sisters. They may be half sisters. So I don't think that would necessarily mean that that's a feral bee, but it just has different genetics than, say, an Italian honeybee that has more orange coloration.
Okay. How quickly, on average, do flowers recharge their nectar?
Oh, that's a great question. So it depends is the answer. It depends on the flower. It depends whether we're in a droughty period or not. And so each flower has kind of a different schedule that it's on. Maybe a flower species may put all its nectar out in the morning, and when it's gone, it's gone. Or they may top off during the day. And so this kind of teaches the bee, well, if you leave, but if you come back, I'll have a little bit more nectar for you. Or there might be a rhythm, like I'll have some nectar out for you in the morning and midday and later in the day. And so it very much matters, depends based on the kind of plant, the kind of flower. But bees actually learn that. They learn that rhythm. They know which flowers to visit when, based on what the reward is going to be, how it's going to be released.
Do you know how polyester bees got their name?
Oh, it's a great story. I wrote in this question because I wanted to talk about it. So polyester bees have a gland in their abdomen, and they actually secrete this polyester-like substance to waterproof that little cell underground. So remember, she's going in and out of that tunnel, and she coats that little bubble in the ground where her offspring is going to be with this cellophane or polyester-like substance. Inside there is the bee bread and the egg, and then she seals off. So she's made a little waterproof bubble there underground. So even if that soil floods, for example, at the botanical garden or beside a riverbank, these are common places, riverbanks, where polyester bees will nest, the offspring is at least a little protected by being in this little waterproof bubble.
Okay, big question from several people. How do you get rid of carpenter bees, or how do you keep them from doing so much damage?
Oh, I'm sorry, Pam, we're out of time. No, I'm just kidding. So carpenter bees are definitely a real issue. And to me, they're a gateway bee, because we all know carpenter bees. Probably most of us have not been stung by carpenter bees. We've been annoyed by them. We know how to identify them. We see those males kind of, coming right in front of our faces and trying to scare us away. Basically, you need to treat that nest, that colony in the wood, or those galleries in the wood with an insecticide, with a labeled insecticide, so that you're killing those adult bees. What I didn't mention about carpenter bees is that they overwinter. So right now they're adults, males and females, tucked in those holes, those perfectly round holes that we can already look up, in our porch and we can see them. We need to treat that. This is a great time to do that. Of course, looking up research-based information and using a labeled product, applying a pesticide up into that gallery before they become active, so that we're killing those early bees as they get active. What they do is emerge from that tunnel, they mate, and then the female starts to gather pollen and nectar and provision cells in that gallery. So much like the leaf-cutting bees and the mason bees, one by one, kind of lining up pollen and nectar with an egg, and then she uses sawdust to seal off that little cell, and then does that over and over and over. So if we wait to treat until later in the year, let's say 2 months from now, where she's already provisioned some of those cells, the offspring they already have the food, they're nice and protected, they can still develop in there, even if the adults are dead. And then they can emerge as new adults. And they just keep chewing out that wood. So over time, they really can do significant damage. So what I tell people is when you see sawdust on the ground from carpenter bees, you need to do something. You can't wait.
Okay, question. People are recommending that you leave your perennials and grasses up over the winter and then clear it away in the spring. At what point in time do you clear away the debris, and do we have to be really diligent about this? Can you address that?
So it's a really delicate balance, right? Because some of our moths and butterflies may be overwintering as cocoons that look like leaves or blend in really well with fallen leaves. And so if we're being, really uber tidy and cleaning everything up, bagging it and trashing that debris, then those caterpillars or those pupa can never emerge as adults. So my best recommendation is to be less tidy, right? Try to allow some leaf litter, allow some a little looser level of cleanup in the garden. If you actually have to have everything tidy, you can clean up your debris, but loosely pile it. Don't burn the pile, right? But loosely pile it in a place that, as cocoon develops in the adult moth emerges, or as the overwintering bees emerge, they have a place to come out. They're not in the bottom of your compost pile. But I think some of it is developing a different ethic on what kind of landscape we have. I really love Doug Tallamy's teachings, and I want my landscape to be a living thing. I want lots of creatures coming to my garden. It's not all about me and lots of mulch and not a lot of life. And so leaving some of that natural aspect is an important change that we can make as gardeners that makes a big difference.
Okay. Several questions, Denise, about the cards. Can they email you for specifics in terms of packaging, posting, or do you want to address that right now? The self-addressed envelope.
Okay, so if you're going to, so please don't email me and ask me for a bee card because, because I don't have envelopes at home. So I want you to send me a self-addressed stamped business-sized envelope. So just like we used to in the old days, you remember, just fold it up with a stamp on it, address it to yourself, put it in an envelope and mail it to me, and then I'll just open it up. All I have to do is slide a card in and put it in the mail. So please don't email me and ask me, because I think there's 800 of you on the call, and it'll take me I have a lot of time, but that'll take me a long time to do.
What size envelope they're asking?
Business size. So,
Okay. Couple questions.
It's like a 5x7 card.
I plant flowers in my vegetable garden. I usually plant them all in one area, 5x20. Should I plant in smaller patches in the garden for better pollination?
Oh, perfect. So yeah, if you can spread out, sometimes we think of having, okay, we've got the vegetable garden and then we've got the cutting garden, and they are two separate things. But if you can incorporate a few more flowers into the vegetable garden, just as you have suggested, the bees are going to visit those flowers as well as visiting your vegetables. So incorporating them is ideal. Also allow some of your vegetables to go to flower. So if you're growing arugula or lettuce or broccoli and you're kind of done with the harvest, let those plants be there and let them develop their flowers. And if you want, you can save some seeds depending on how you're growing them. But those flowers are often good for pollinators. Arugula, some of those early mustards, you'll see some different pollinators visiting those flowers.
Okay, your address in Massillon again, please. People seem to want those bee cards.
Sure, absolutely. Oh, look, Ringo and Zoe, you got to see them. There you go.
There we go. And then one final question here, and then we'll finish up. How do I deal with my yard when my town sprays for mosquitoes some summers? Does the spray hurt my bees in the yard?
So I do have on my website, I have some information on mosquitoes and bees. It is a big question. If you're a beekeeper, you probably know what products are being sprayed and how that spraying happens, but there are definitely concerns about, because they're using insecticides, and those if those products get on flowers, even if they spray at night, those residues could hurt bees. So I would start with your municipality or township, whoever's doing that spraying, and find out what they're using, what their schedule is, and what kind of notification they can give you if you're a beekeeper, so that you can close up your hives to kind of protect your bees.
Okay, Denise, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Everybody would be giving you a big hand if they possibly could right now. I want to wrap up with a few final things. We are trying to keep these on time for an hour. I am going to launch a poll for some information that we are going to be collecting. So you should be seeing the poll right now. If you are online, please fill that out. We want you to rate the value of the webinar. Did you learn something new today? And again, have you planted something in your garden? And while you're filling that out, a reminder, we will be sending out a recording link. Once it's finished, it takes a little time for the Zoom software to compile the recording. So we will send that link out to you. We will also have these recordings housed on the state website and YouTube. Once we get that organized, we'll send you the information through VMS. And again, we will send periodic reminders through VMS for these webinars. The next Horticulture Happy Hour tomorrow at 4 o'clock will be Dr. Natalie Baumgardner from University of Tennessee talking about microgreens. And then Thursday's Lunch and Learn at noon will be Jacqueline Kowalski talking about best practices for community gardens. So to share the poll results so that everybody can see what you are talking about, I would say, Denise, that this was absolutely an outstanding webinar. 4s and 5s, 93% 5s. 99% of the folks learned something new today. And in terms of planting the garden, people are still working on getting out there. So again, thank you all. I really appreciate you joining in. We'll continue to try to keep you updated as much as possible. Stay in contact with your County Master Gardener coordinators so that we make sure you're getting updates from the university on what's happening. And Denise, it looks like there's still more questions to ask. I think we're going to bring you back on at another point in time just for a simple question and answer period, if that's okay with you.
Yay, sounds great. And Pam, I think I'm doing something on theme gardens for pollinators coming up. So you have me on the schedule somewhere.
Excellent, excellent. That's how far behind I am. I don't even know what tomorrow is. All right, everybody, thank you again for coming. And again, watch for the recording and sign up for the other webinars at the State Master Gardener website. That's mastergardener.osu.edu. Thank you, everybody, for coming on. Denise, at the high time, we had 1,032 people, or 1,132 people. So very, very great, great. Thank you.
Super. Thanks. Bye.